Shout out to G-Man Boxing.
I said to you guys I'm explosive, I said I'm entertaining. I go out there, I throw bombs from the start. You know, a lot of people think going up to heavyweight I might have lost some of my power. But listen, I'm the hardest pound for pound puncher in the world in any weight division. And the man standing to my right is the guy I'm going after, you know, the number one fighter in the world. Him and his brother. Toss a coin.
How do we get from a boxing playboy with a celebrity status, the first heavyweight champion, British heavyweight champion since Lennox Lewis, how do we get from that, you know, roaring fan base, the precursor to Anthony Joshua, how do we get from that to injury ridden, to managing fighters? How do we get to managing a fighter who you not only beat, but you ended up having a row with and having a tear up with at a press conference, and you ended up having to flee a country? How do we go from one extreme to the other? Well, we're going to have a look-see today. We're going to find out. Lads and lassies, I'm going to be delving into a certain Mr. David Haye CV. I'm going to be asking you all the question, what the fuck happened to David Haye? Alright, so David Haye as an amateur was actually quite successful. He medalled at Commonwealth Games. He started out his amateur career at light heavyweight, right? But David Haye, from early on, was fixated with being a heavyweight, right? He wanted to fight as a heavyweight. He wanted to be heavyweight champion of the world, right? He wasn't content to be light heavyweight champion. He wasn't content to be cruiserweight champion. This guy wanted to be heavyweight champion. So much so that by his own admission, he even used to add weights into his trunk so he'd add a few extra pounds to make sure he was fighting a heavyweight. All right, now he trained at Finchley Lodge, which is in London. And, you know, he had some success as an amateur, definitely. He lost to Audley Harrison, which was one of his last amateur fights, before turning pro. Now, when he turned pro to a lot of fanfare, right? He made his pro debut against a guy called Tony Bellew. He was seen very early on as this kind of boxing playboy. This was a guy turning pro who was charismatic, he had a lot of charisma, you know, was good looking, he was modelling. He was just kind of what British boxing needed, all right? Because at the time in the cruiserweight division, he turned pro at cruiserweight. Johnny Nelson was cruiserweight champion. He was WBO cruiserweight champion. Johnny Nelson was a great cruiserweight. He was a great cruiserweight champion. He wasn't exactly the most entertaining fighter you'd ever want to see. He did have some entertaining performances, but for the most part, Johnny Nelson was very much a safety-first fighter. Along comes David Haye, who is just a polar opposite. David Haye was all about knockouts. He was loud, abrasive, he was good-looking, he was knocking people out. He came with a bit of a reputation. So much so that in his fifth fight against the guy called Vince Wynn, I think that's how you pronounce the guy's name, he knocked that guy out in a round. Funny enough, that was at the Playboy Mansion in Beverly Hills, right? This was, put it like this, right? This was in the early 2000s. A guy coming straight out of the amateurs to turn pro in his fifth pro fight is fighting in Beverly Hills, right? At the Playboy Mansion. So this kind of shows the kind of character David Haye was. When David Haye turned pro, he was trained by Adam Booth. Now, Adam Booth was actually a trainer in Finchley Lodge, which was David Haye's amateur gym. So them two they were a package deal. Before David Haye turned pro, him and Adam Booth sat in a KFC restaurant, right? And they mapped out a plan for David Haye's pro career. They said that they will turn pro, they'll make as much money as they can, they'll win their titles, and they will get out of this sport by the age of 30. Why did they do that? There are several reasons for that. Right, the idea of boxing is obviously to win your titles, to do what you can do, but it's also to maximize your revenue. You have a finite window where you can make as much money as you can. And David Haye's style was typical Adam Booth, ambush. David Haye wasn't into having a chess match with anybody. David Haye would stay on the outside. He would wait for you to overcommit, and then he would counter you, or he'd try and beat you to the punch. David Haye was someone who relied on reflexes, speed, athleticism, Roy Jones-esque. Very seldom did you see David Haye go to the body. Very seldom did you see David Haye throw jabs. David Haye was just a typical counter-puncher, try and beat you to the punch, try and use his athleticism, speed, reflex, etc., etc. Why did they want to get out by 30? Because that's in around the age that athleticism the reflexes, the speed will start to diminish. And if you don't have your technical ability, you know, fine-tuned, that's when you're going to start to struggle. So they planned on getting out by then. David Haye, early on in his career, was, as I said, you know, the boxing playboy. Was amassing a record. You know, he was knocking guys out. He was doing it in good fashion. But the first alarm bells for David Haye really started ringing when he fought a guy called Wladimir. All right, now this was on the BBC. As you see there on screen, David Haye got dropped in the second round against Wladimir. And as you can see, the knockdown was on the top of the head, from a right hand. Mock was 183 pounds in that fight. To put this in context, okay, Wladimir fought David Haye in the early 2000s. He was 183 pounds. He dropped David Haye worse than he's ever been hurt. I don't think David Haye in his whole career has ever been hurt worse than he was in that second round against Wladimir. And I include the Tony Bellew fight in that. I don't think David Haye was ever hurt as worse. He was really on the back foot in that fight after that. Wladimir fought David Haye in the early 2000s. I can't exactly remember the actual date. I think it might have been 2003. To put this in context, Wladimir fought Avni Yildirim in 2018. And that's the Avni Yildirim who got iced in 3 rounds by Canelo. That's the same person who fought David Haye all those years ago. So that kind of puts it in context what we're dealing with here. That Wladimir, he's been around the block. As it stands, Wladimir hasn't fought since 2019. David Haye remains the only person to have stopped Wladimir. He knocked Wladimir out with a tremendous uppercut. As you'll see there, he got up, but he was on unsteady legs. And the referee waved it off. That was a worrying sign for David Haye, that it showed that he could be hurt, that he was a little bit vulnerable. But he was able to weather the storm and get through the crisis. He would eventually come unstuck. He would come unstuck in his 11th pro fight. Alright, this was for the IBO cruiserweight world title. Oh, and I must stress, at this time, cruiserweight, the limit was 190 pounds. Okay, they did eventually move it to 200 pounds a little after he fought Carl Thompson. But at that time, when David Haye turned pro, the limit for cruiserweight was 190 pounds. Alright, when he fought Carl Thompson was, he was either in his late 30s or he was about 40 years old, but he'd seen better days, Carl Thompson. Carl Thompson was known as a tough guy who'd been in up and down wars, right? He had great fights. He fought a guy called Ezra Sellers, and that was just an up and down fight. Carl Thompson was like that. He was always in up and down fights, you know. Could be hurt. Johnny Nelson hurt Carl Thompson quite bad when they fought, so he could be hurt. So this was kind of seen as a bit of a coming of age fight for David Haye. David Haye come unstuck in that fight. He tried to blast Carl Thompson out early. Through everything he had, Carl Thompson was still there. And by the 5th round, David Haye, he had nothing left. His gas tank was gone. He was taken to deep waters. And as the saying goes, he was taken to deep waters and then he was drowned. He was stopped in the 5th round by Carl Thompson. The excuse David Haye gave was that he was actually dictating the pace. Believe it or not, that he wasn't gassed, that he was slowing the pace down because he was planning to take Carl Thompson late. That's where we kind of see David Haye be economical with the truth. Because if anyone's ever watched that fight, you'll see straight away that David Haye had absolutely nothing left. You know, he'd no stamina, he blew his tank too early, and he just had nothing left. He just gassed. David Haye returned 3 months to the day later, alright? Straight away you could see that David Haye was taking things a lot more serious. Alright, he looked in better shape. It was like that loss galvanized David Haye. Because at the time, when David Haye was, you know, before that Carl Thompson fight, as I said at the start, David Haye was the boxing playboy. You know, he was known to gain a few pounds in between fights. He liked the nightlife. He liked the celebrity status. He wanted that fame, right? And at the time, he was kind of going a bit overboard. As he said himself, that Carl Thompson fight, it was almost like a light switched on in his head. That this is when he started taking things very serious. He started training harder, watching his diet, and really focusing on boxing. Where before he was focusing on a lot of other things and boxing was kind of a side note. This was when he focused on boxing. In hindsight, he said the Carl Thompson fight was a blessing in disguise. It was the best thing that could have happened to him, was taking that loss against Carl Thompson. And I have to agree, because David Haye looked much, much more improved after that. Alright, at least up until he won his heavyweight title, but we will get on to that later. That's one thing you have to remember, is that a lot of these pros early on can take losses. If they learn from it, it can be a good thing. You know, a similar situation we see with an Adam Boo fighter today, Josh Kelly. He stepped up a little bit too soon against someone who was a little bit too wily, a little bit too good. He came unstuck. We need to see how he looks. Very similar story, actually, Josh Kelly is to David Haye. You know, a lot of fanfare, a lot of hype, you know, a lot of publicity. Came unstuck. We need to see how he looks. So following on from the loss to Carl Thompson, David Haye had a couple of comeback fights, but then found himself in a fight for the European cruiserweight title, all right, against the guy called Alexander Gurov. Alexander Gurov was an Eastern European. He was a big 6'5" guy. He had a record of 37-4 at the time he fought David Haye. Now David Haye claimed, this is a claim, that in the amateurs he had never lost to an Eastern European. That the Eastern European style, where at the time they were very stiff. You know, it was very long, very upright, they're very stiff. David Haye said that style suits him perfectly. Whenever he fights them, he just knocks them out. He went in there and he fought Gurov, he knocked him out in a round. Alright, it was a tremendous right hand that he landed on Gurov, took him out. I mean, that was within the first minute. David Haye used that as ammunition for what he would do if he fought a Klitschko. Now bear in mind, he hadn't even won a world title at cruiserweight at this stage, and he was already mentioning the Klitschkos. So you could see what his plan was. You could see that he really wanted to go for the heavyweight title. He wasn't planning on sticking around at cruiserweight. He wanted to be a heavyweight. David Haye, even at cruiserweight, was lifting a hell of a lot of weights. He was lifting a hell of a lot of weights, drinking a hell of a lot of protein powder. So you could tell David Haye, he really wanted to venture into the heavyweight division. And heavyweight boxing in Britain, but in general at the time, was in a really, really bad place. You had the two Klitschkos reigning supreme, and then you had the contenders. Many of them were too short, many of them were not in shape, many of them weren't even big punchers. A lot of cases, it was all three. So in Britain, you had guys like Danny Williams, Michael Sprott, Audley Harrison, Matt Skelton. Most of these guys were tough guys, but they weren't going to set the world. They were never going to set the world stage alight. Danny Williams obviously had a crack to Vitaly Klitschko when he took a terrible beating in that fight. He was up and down off the canvas several times. Audley Harrison had won an Olympic gold medal, but his career was kind of a bit all over the place. Sprott and Skelton, again, tough guys, but they were never going to make any incursions into the world stage. So you had David Haye, this upcoming cruiserweight, who was looking to take on heavyweights. Now, in his next fight after he won the EBU title, he fought a guy called Ismail Abdul. Now, this guy, a very, very, very tough man. Alright, very tough. Only ever been stopped once by Wladimir, and that was in the 12th round of a 12-round fight. He took David Haye the full 12-round distance. Now, we lost every minute of every round, but he was the first man, because at this time, David Haye had never been the distance in any fight. Whether it was a 6-rounder, an 8-rounder, 10-rounder, he'd never been the distance. So this was the first time he'd ever gone the distance, and it was the full 12 rounds. Alright. Abdul, very, very tough man. Alright, so it was able to show that David Haye, one of the issues he had was in the Carl Thompson fight, you know, he gassed after 5 rounds. He was able to go to 12 rounds. David Haye has never been someone who's fought at a frantic pace, it has to be said, but at least he was able to go to rounds. His next fight then, which was an interesting one, was against an undefeated guy called Fragomeni. Alright, this was his last, well, this was perceived to be his last fight at cruiserweight. This was for the European title. Now, he defended it against Fragomeni. Fragomeni was not a big puncher, but a very relentless fighter. He was able to cut David Haye quite badly, alright, to the point where there was blood. There's blood everywhere. Now, there's blood on Fragomeni, there's blood over David Haye's eye. You know, he got a cut. It was close. If you go on BoxRec, the scorecards will tell you that was a close competitive fight. David Haye was able to get rid of him in 8 rounds. In David Haye's next fight, he fought a guy called Thomas Bonin. What's significant about this fight is this is David Haye's first fight at heavyweight. Alright, he was 217 pounds for this fight. He knocked Thomas Bonin out in a round. He had him down a couple of times. This was on Sky Sports. Alright, David Haye, early on in his career, as I said earlier, was fighting on BBC. Now, he turned pro. He was promoted by Frank Maloney. Okay, but David Haye wanted to be independent. He didn't want to be tied into a major promoter. He didn't want to be signing with Maloney. He sure as hell didn't want to sign with Frank Warren. What David Haye did in his career, him and Adam Booth, they founded Haymaker. Alright, they put on shows. Right, they had people like Dave Colwell in there as the unofficial, they had him as the official promoter when David Haye and Haymaker were really the ones doing all the work. I have to admire that from David Haye, because David Haye was someone who, when he wanted to go in there and make money, he wanted to do everything for himself. Right? He didn't want to be tied into a promoter. He didn't want to have any of these, deals going where, you fight on my net. No, he wanted to do everything independently, make the lion's share of the cash, and that's that. So I have to admire that, and I always want to see the fighter get paid and not have to go down the road of, contract this promoter, this, that with our promoter, giving him this. David Haye just wanted to, get the lion's share of the purse, get paid, put on his own shows, etc., etc. So I had to admire that. Now, when he fought Thomas Bonin, he said that he might stay at heavyweight. A lot of people said that he looked better at heavyweight than he did at cruiserweight. Obviously, he was 217 pounds, so, David Haye has always been someone who lifts a hell of a lot of weights. All right, David Haye, even at cruiserweight, as I said earlier, was someone who was lifting weights left, right, and centre. David Haye, it might have been in around this time, or it might have been a little bit after, but he gave an interview with Steve Bunce. All right, I think this was on Setanta, back when Setanta were a thing, Setanta Sports. Steve Bunce basically asked him, how much are you weighing, David, outside the ring? So, outside of camp, outside of fighting, how much do you weigh? Are you a natural heavyweight? And David Haye actually said he weighs 235 pounds. Yeah. Right. Now, bear this in mind. Klitschko, Wladimir, weighs in around the 240s. So, David Haye was leading you to believe that he weighed naturally 10 pounds less than Wladimir Klitschko. Not many people were buying that, and I don't think there was much of a debate that it may have been a bit of a tall tale. Was there a debate?
Well, it's a fairly short debate, Murray. End of message. 3 minutes to go.
Thanks for that. Now, this is where we start seeing David Haye be a bit economical with the truth, which is something that you will see throughout his career. It's really something we saw from the Carl Thompson fight, all right, where he said that he was setting the pace and it wasn't him running out of gas, which that's clearly wasn't true. Now, David Haye did go back to cruiserweight for his next fight. He went to France to face Jean-Marc Mormec. This performance right here, although David Haye was down in this fight, this to me is the most impressive and complete performance of David Haye's career. If you want to look at a prime David Haye, this fight and the fight after it against Enzo Maccarinelli are the two fights that I would say, when you look at David Haye and you think about PK, this was PK. But the Mormec performance was better, I believe, than the Maccarinelli performance. Even though we got rid of Maccarinelli in better fashion, the variety he showed against Mormec. His judge at distance was very good. He was short in his punches. He was jabbing. He was going to Mormec's body. The things you don't see David Haye do, when he did them very well. Yes, he had to get up off the canvas, but he showed that he was able to get through adversity, and he was able to take Mormec out in 7 rounds. To me, peak David Haye. Had we had that David Haye against Tony Bellew, Tony Bellew would have been in all sorts of trouble. All right? That is, for my money, peak David Haye. His next fight was against Enzo Maccarinelli. Right, this was at the O2. Enzo was the WBO cruiserweight champion at the time. So this was a unification fight. David Haye to WBC, WBA. Right? At the time, Haye was very, very dismissive of Maccarinelli. And at the time, Maccarinelli, it's easy to look back now and say, well, he should have been. Maccarinelli's lost, he's been stopped so many times. But yeah, but at this time, Maccarinelli only had 1 loss. And he was knocking people out left, right, and centre. To put it in context, he knocked out Marcelo Dominguez. Marcelo Dominguez was a former cruiserweight world champion, and he was quite useful, Marcelo Dominguez, at cruiserweight. Marcelo Dominguez at the time had never been stopped, and he was coming off the back of a loss, which really should have been a win over Nikolai Valuev. Alright, he lost that fight over 8 rounds. I encourage any, because it's on YouTube, to go and watch Marcelo Dominguez versus Nikolai Valuev. It's one of the strangest sights you'll ever see. You literally have Nikolai Valuev, 7'1", in the ring with this 5'9", grossly overweight cruiserweight. It really did look like they just got someone out of a pub and said, go in there and fight Valuev. How a man who's 5'9" with a 71-inch reach is able to land so consistently on a guy 7 foot, I'll never know. But go online, look at that fight. Go on BoxRec and look at the scorecards. The scorecards for that fight were absurd. Alright, Marcelo Dominguez beat Nikolai Valuev over 8 rounds. Never was really even any trouble in that fight, to be honest with you. But of course, Nikolai Valuev got so many dubious decisions. It was actually it's quite extraordinary, really, that someone who was so untalented, and Nikolai Valuev was not a good fighter, unpopular because he wasn't a cash cow, got so many good gift decisions. It was actually quite incredible when you think about it. But yeah, Macronelli had knocked out guys like Dominguez, big puncher. So people saw this as a bit of a 50-50 fight because they knew, alright, Macronelli's been dropped a few times, but David Haye's not exactly got a granite chin. So they expected fireworks in this fight. But David Haye, very dismissive. This was another example of David Haye. Something I have to admire is that he was able to go on a Frank Warren show, beat Frank Warren's fighter, take his title, and then just sail off into the sunset, not being tied into any long-term deal. Because as we know, certainly nowadays, when fighters go and fight another promoter's show, if they're not with a major promoter and this, that, and the other, there's rematches, there's this, there's that, there's all kinds of shenanigans going on. Whereas with David Haye, it was a case of, I'm running my end of the show, I'm going on to your show, I'm beating your fighter, and I'm taking my pay, I'm taking your fighter's belt, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. And that's what David Haye did. He went in there, even the jabs early on in that first round were hurting Macronelli. Macronelli, the first round was kind of a feeling out round, but you could tell David Haye was in control and that Macronelli was being troubled by the jabs. Second round came, landed a big right hand on Enzo Macronelli, you actually opened up a flurry of punches at Macronelli in the corner. Referee jumped in and stopped it. It was the correct decision, and Macronelli really never recovered from that loss. From then on, Macronelli never had a granite chin, but from then on, he was getting hurt a lot more. He got knocked out by Afolabi, Lebedev, he got stopped by Bramer. I think who else was he stopped by? He was stopped by Owen McKelty. That was a BS stoppage, to be fair, but Macronelli was never quite the same after that. So after David Haye fought Enzo Macronelli, he actually fought Monty Barrett at heavyweight. Now, Monty Barrett at the time had seen better days, but David Haye really tried to market Monty Barrett as a game contender, as one of, outside the champions, one of the most dangerous fighters you could fight in heavyweight. He certainly wasn't. Monty Barrett at the time had seen much better days. But David Haye, of course, decided, let's give this guy a shot. I'm going to try and sell this, be a snake oil salesman, sell this to the public. Monty Barrett fight wasn't competitive. He got rid of him in 5 rounds. He did what he needed to do. And then he was going to move on and fight for a title. Next fight for David Haye. Went over to Germany. He was going to go fight for the WBA Heavyweight Championship of the World against Nikolai Valuev. Now, Nikolai Valuev in his last fight, his fight before this, he had fought an old as dirt Evander Holyfield. He won the fight, but he didn't really. Holyfield, he would have been touching 50, for my money, beat Nikolai Valuev. And there have been others who have beaten Nikolai Valuev and not got the decisions. John Ruiz, for my money, beat Nikolai Valuev. Marcelo Dominguez, for my money, beat Nikolai Valuev. Evander Holyfield beat Nikolai Valuev for my money. Alright? Nikolai Valuev was, I think, promoted by Don King at the time. And he was getting these... This was where Germany was getting a rep for being, a bit tricky to get a decision. Because he was getting these gift decisions. Now, David Haye gave it all the you-know-what. He was going to go over. He was going to slay the giant. He was going to knock Nikolai Valuev out. It was going to be a fantastic, exciting performance. Remember Barry McGuigan saying that David Haye is going to go. He is going to go in there. He's going to put it on Nikolai Valuev. He's going to knock him out. Well, that didn't happen. David Haye fought safety first. Proper ambush style. Just stayed on the outside, avoiding Nikolai Valuev at all cost. Jim Watt commentated on that fight. And Jim Watt is a kind of Marmite character when it comes to commentating. Me personally, I always liked Jim Watt. He was... Jim Watt was a Sky commentator, right? He alone could call Sky fights and do better than the whole Sky team they have now. Jim Watt was criticised in that fight because he scored the fight. He said, this is what he said. He said he was going to score the fight from the eyes of a judge in Germany. Alright? So, essentially what he was doing is, he was looking at that fight and saying, right, well, I think David Haye's winning these rounds. But the way he's fighting, would a judge in Germany give him that round? Alright? And that's actually quite logical, That's quite logical. If Matthew Macklin or Carl Froch had been scoring that fight, 120, 108 to David Haye, easy. David Haye fought very negatively. Alright, he really did. He hurt Valuev in the 12th round. It was the first time, I don't think Valuev's ever been buzzed. And the end of the fight, scorecards read out. 114, a draw. 2 scorecards of 116, 112 to David Haye. David Haye picked up his world title. He was now heavyweight champion. WBA heavyweight champion. From 2009 to 2011, David Haye was WBA heavyweight champion. These were his glory years, right? This was when he went full-blown celebrity. You know, he was in pictures with a lot of celebrities. He was eating out in all these expensive restaurants. He was really living the high life. You know, these were his peak years, not in terms of his performance, of his athleticism, his prime, or anything like that. It was in the sense of he was a celebrity. He was milking that WBA title. Yeah, he's milking that title. He was enjoying life. In some ways, I think he enjoyed it a bit too much because his next fight was against John Ruiz. Now, I'll give David Haye credit, benefit of the doubt. I was going to say credit, but I'll give him the benefit because this was a mandatory. John Ruiz was mandatory with the WBA, and David Haye had to take this fight. Now, we fought him at the O2. This was, at the time, this was career heaviest for David Haye. He was 222 pounds. Okay? David Haye, after he won that title, as I said, was enjoying the nightlife. There was a restaurant he ate in London. I forget the name of it, but he was eating steaks there, everything. So he really kind of, for that fight, went back to his, you know, early on pro career where he was just kind of, you know, partying, enjoying himself a bit. It was a decent performance from Haye. You know, John Ruiz, although he'd been stopped before, he was durable enough, but David Haye was able to put him down in the first round with a tremendous right hand, and eventually he dominated that fight, took him out in 9 rounds. That was a mandatory. He had to get it out of the way. He did. David Haye had been calling for the Klitschkos. He'd been calling for both Klitschkos. He said he wanted one for lunch and the other for brunch. Right? He'd been talking about them for a while. Right? We knew he was going to be fighting again on Sky Box Office. Right? So we're thinking, right? Okay, we're thinking about this, right? It's going to be Wladimir. Alright? It's going to be Vitaly. Right? If it's not, who else do we have? Because, like, right, it's going to be pay-per-view. Right? So it's got to be someone, right? It's got to be someone. Could it be Povetkin? Right? Could he fight Povetkin? Right? Because Povetkin is, you know, still, you know, he's on his way up, but, you know, he's kind of thereabouts. Could he fight Povetkin? Right? Pay-per-view. Could he be bringing Marco Huck up from cruiserweight? You know, he's kind of taken over cruiserweight now that David Haye is gone. Could he bring Marco Huck up? You know, who is he going to fight? Is he going to fight someone real good? Right? So we're thinking, oh, who is he going? He's going to fight Audley Harrison. On pay-per-view, Audley Harrison. What did Audley Harrison do to earn that fight? He knocked out Michael Sprott in the 12th round of a fight he was losing. Where do I even start with this? Really, where do I even begin? He fought Audley Harrison on pay-per-view. And the fight was everything it was perceived to be. You know, it was a horrible mismatch. They didn't even land a punch. Audley Harrison barely threw a punch in 3 rounds and got taken out by David Haye. Why in God's name? And you know what the worst part is, right? Because this was David Haye being a snake oil salesman, calling the public. There's no other way you can use it. There's no other word to describe it, I should say. You know, this was a mismatch for a world title on pay-per-view. Right? Audley Harrison barely threw a punch. David Haye had the audacity to come out then after that and say, well, this is who the fans wanted to see. They didn't want to see me fight Klitschko. They wanted to see me fight Audley. No, they didn't. Alright? There's no debating that. We all wanted the Klitschko fight. Was there a debate? Again, Martin Brundle, was there a debate?
Well, it's a fairly short debate, Murray. End of message. 3 minutes to go.
Thanks for that again. No, there was no debate. This was just David Haye conning the public with a pay-per-view of a complete mismatch. He said in the build-up, and I ain't going to repeat what he said, we all know what he said, that this fight would be horribly one-sided. Alright, it was a bit different than that. We all know what he said, but YouTube will have an absolute field day with me if I say it. So, you know what he said about that fight. But yeah, look, it was what it was. He gave Audley a shot. That was the first time a lot of us would have seen Eddie Hearn, because Eddie Hearn was actually promoting Audley Harrison at the time. You know, so many of us hadn't seen Eddie Hearn. This kind of knocked Sky Box Office for a while. But 2011 comes along. David Haye's next fight, it is Wladimir Klitschko in Germany. A lot of people were thinking David Haye is going to win this fight. He's fast, he's explosive, he's powerful. It's the first real challenge that Klitschko has had, you know, in many a year. Alright, because he had been running through, him and Vitali had been running through an extremely weak heavyweight division. It's not their fault. They were the guys who were around. But you guys, some of the guys who could punch like Sam Peter were out of shape. Their age was in question. They weren't fast nor durable. It was just a horrible time for heavyweight boxing. And these shows that were getting put on in Germany by the Klitschkos, the referees were disgraceful. Not really Vitali. Vitali was never a dirty fighter, but Wladimir was. This fight was a terrible fight. Wladimir was quicker than I think David Haye perceived. So when he was trying to lunge in with the right hand, and one thing about David Haye, when he fight taller guys, he really didn't do much. He would really just stay on the outside, look for an open, throw the right hand. But Wladimir would see the right hand come and just move out of the way. And David Haye would always throw himself off balance. Now, whenever David Haye say got close to Wladimir, what would Wladimir do? Well, he'd grab and pull David Haye's head down. Now, you're not allowed to do that in boxing, but the referee allowed it. In fact, there was a knockdown in that fight that wasn't a knockdown. I think it was in the 11th round where David Haye got like fumbled to the ground by Wladimir. The referee called it a knockdown. It was really disgraceful. Now, I'm not saying with a legit referee, David Haye would have won the fight. No, but I think it would have been a hell of a lot more competitive than it was. It was really bad what was going on back in the height of the Klitschko's reign with referees in Germany. You know, obviously when he fought Povetkin, that was in Russia, but that was... And the ironic thing is, and this was the really dubious thing, referees like Louis Pabon, who refereed the Klitschko fight against Povetkin, did a terrible job and let Klitschko away with so much holding, it was insane. But they've gone on to do fine performances as referees since then. So it really is beggars belief as to what was going on during the Klitschko's reign, because Louis Pabon against Povetkin, terrible job. But he's since done fine. You know, I've seen him, I think he refereed Ruiz versus Joshua the rematch. And I've seen Louis Pabon several times and he's been absolutely fine. So you do wonder what goes on with some of these referees. But the referee in the Haye fight, Haye couldn't do anything. And Klitschko was just too big. Right, he was just too big. David Haye just met his match at heavyweight. Alright, now the excuses came from David Haye. Now, David Haye said he was carrying an injury into that fight. Right? Now, fighters do carry injuries. It has to be said, hand injuries, you know, they do carry injuries. Do you know what David Haye's injury was? Right? He had a broken pinky toe. Yeah, right. I'm not really sure what exactly a broken pinky toe would have much of an effect on you, or how it could. To be honest with David Haye, I don't discredit that. I don't discount that, because as a fighter, you don't want to give your opponent any mental advantage whatsoever, right? But the excuses David Haye was saying that he couldn't pivot properly, he couldn't explode off, I really find that quite dubious. But in there with Wladimir, and at the end of the day, he said he didn't want to give. But like, how could Wladimir, unless Wladimir wants to step on your foot, there's not really anything he could do that would exasperate the injury. But then again, this is Wladimir Klitschko, and Wladimir probably would have tried to step on the foot if he'd given half the chance, because any advantage you give Wladimir, he'd take it. I mean, if David Haye came out and said, I have an uneven testicle, Wladimir would aim for it. You know, sort of way. That's another good analogy by your boy. That's just came into my head there. But yeah, maybe again another good analogy to add to the list of analogies I've used on this channel that you've never heard before. Welcome to your boy's channel. But yeah, that was the excuse David Haye gave. He then started targeting the fight with Vitali, because Vitali was the older of the two. He was looking to have slowed down a bit. Alright, he was looking to have slowed down a bit, so he started targeting the fight with Vitali Klitschko. Vitali Klitschko was going to fight Derek Chisora. Alright, that was a good fight. Vitali Klitschko had the toughest fight since Lennox Lewis against Derek Chisora. The crazy thing about that is that David Haye and Derek Chisora, at the press conference for Vitali Klitschko versus Derek Chisora, David Haye ended up getting into a big fight. That was where we heard the famous, he glassed me. You know, David Haye threw shots at him, threw shots at Don Charles. I think Derek Chisora got arrested because he knocked the cameraman down or something like that, but it was mayhem, it was bedlam. Derek Chisora, I think, got arrested. David Haye ended up having to flee the country. Yeah, he had to flee the country, Germany. I think Derek Chisora actually got suspended by the British Boxing Board of Control for his actions, because he was really having a field day. He spat water in Wladimir's face after that fight, or just before the fight. So Derek Chisora actually ended up getting suspended by the British Boxing Board of Control. A year, 2012, right, was when we actually got Chisora versus Haye in another very, very, very good performance by David Haye. Interesting fact, Chisora was suspended. David Haye wasn't suspended, but his license was not renewed, or he didn't renew it from the British Boxing Board of Control. This fight was actually sanctioned by the Luxembourg Boxing Control. I'm not sure what it's called. We'll just call it the Luxembourg Boxing Board of Control. I don't know exactly the definition of what it's actually called over there, but we'll just call it that for argument's sake. Now, the British Boxing Board of Control said that any fighters who take place on that show will be suspended, right? Or action will be taken against them. Derek Chisora was promoted by Frank Warren, and Frank Warren has taken on the British Boxing Board several times. He's won. We all know Frank Warren's history. We all know what he's like. I think was it Frank Warren or was it Maloney? I think it was Warren who nearly bankrupted the British Boxing Board of Control when he sued them once. I think it was Warren, but Warren, not really someone. Put it like this: if it's one of his shows and it's a big money show, you really don't want to be trying to put that in jeopardy, because Frankie boy, he doesn't play. You know, even if he's in the wrong, he ain't gonna play. So they put that on in Upton Park. Great performance from David Haye. First 4 rounds he was doing very well, but he started to gas. He did appear to gas in that fight, right, going into the 5th round. But then he landed a left hook on Chisora, and this is the thing, David Haye is not known. David Haye can knock you out with either hand, but he's more a right hand heavy puncher. So he knocked Chisora out with a left hook, and at the time, Chisora had been hurt by Robert Helenius in a fight he should have won. But he'd been in there with Tyson Fury, went the distance, lost. He'd been in there with Vitaly Klitschko. Vitaly Klitschko had something like a 90% knockout ratio at the time. Went in there, lost, gave a good account of himself. Wasn't even close to going down. David Haye cleaned Chisora out, right? I know you can say Dylan White did it, but I think that Derek Chisora against Haye was younger, fresher, took a better shot. And David Haye done it definitively. Like Dylan White, yeah, he did do it definitively, but that was a competitive fight. And realistically, it was the point deduction that made Chisora reckless in that fight. You know, to go for the jugular and ended up getting caught. Right? At this point, David Haye, we were looking to see what you do next. He was trying to get that fight with Vitaly Klitschko. It announced then that he'd be fighting Manuel Charr. The Manuel Charr, even at that time, was just a kind of fringe contender. He wasn't anything to write home about, but it was a comeback fight for David Haye nevertheless, and he was going to go into that fight, but then he pulled out of that fight, right? He didn't go ahead with the Manuel Charr fight because he'd signed up to face Tyson Fury in September on Sky Box Office. Now HBO were even going to screen this fight as well. This was a big deal, all right? David Haye at the time, but before he signed for this fight, he said he wasn't interested in facing Tyson Fury until Tyson Fury got dropped by Steve Cunningham. And David Haye, I'm sure, looked at that fight and thought, whoa, would this little cruiserweight drop you like that? Oh, I'm going to knock you out. So they announced that fight. Within 5 days, I think it was like 5 days before the fight, David Haye withdrew from the fight. It was actually expected to be rescheduled. He cited a cut to his eye. Right? Now, I remember at the time, a lot of people were dubious about that. A lot of people felt, some people were actually claiming that he cut his own eye because he needed more time. I don't know. A lot of them are just theories. I suspect David, in fact, I can pretty much guarantee that David Haye had injuries, because this was really when the sand in the hourglass started running out, because that Chisora performance was the last time we saw the Haymaker in the ring, because this is when the injuries started racking up. So he announced the rescheduling of the Tyson Fury fight, but he never even got to that because he ended up having shoulder surgery and announced he was retiring from boxing, right, because the shoulder injury was so bad. He did in 2014 say that he was looking to plan a comeback, but then in 2014 he actually split from Adam Booth. Now bear in mind, he'd been with Adam Booth since the amateurs, right? David Haye was in his 30s at the time, so he'd gone over his age of where he wanted to retire, but he did still want to come back. It was kind of up in the air because we knew David Haye had injuries. We knew that he was a reflex fighter, so those reflexes were definitely going to be dim, and he was getting closer to 30. I think at the time, 2014, when he split Matabu, he would have been about 34. So he was getting on there. Then it was announced that at the start of 2016, he would come back. He'd be trained by Shane McGuigan, all right, who at the time didn't have really many. If you Carl Frampton, that was about it. But He'd be trained by Shane McGuigan. He was going to come back against the guy called Mark Demori. Now, Demori was ranked, believe it or not, by the WBA. He'd beaten nobody. Absolutely nobody. But he was ranked nevertheless by the WBA. And, they sanctioned the fight. David Haye fought him at the O2, as you'll see there. Knocked Mark Demori out in a round. It was a fairly routine fight. Mark Demori was not that good. This was a guy, by his own admission, taught himself to box from YouTube, watching YouTube videos. So, it had to be expected. He'd only one loss on the record. So, it was a decent... Well, I say decent. It wasn't decent, but it was a kind of... If the casuals were looking at it, they'd be thinking, oh, he's only got one loss. But, he wasn't at it in the right home about. But the thing that I found interesting about that is that David Haye, his whole stance looked... Everything about him just looked different. He just looked off. It was still explosive, but he just didn't look right. The way he was planting his feet, everything about him just looked a bit different. And I kind of... Maybe it's just the ring rust. He's been out of the ring for a few years. Maybe it's just that. Maybe next time we see him, it'll be fine. He announced his next fight in May against a guy called Arnold Jajai, who was undefeated at the time. Now, Jajai had been down in fights, but we'd also heard stories about him in the gym that he'd been sent home from a few camps because he was just not that good. And the more he was bad, but he had a bit of ambition, Jajai just... wilted fairly quick. He was dropped by jabs. The fans booed. It was a farce. It was a farce of a performance, right? David Haye was marketing these guys as legit, and the worst part is he ended up getting rankings. He was ranked number 3 by the IBF, and he was actually made at one point mandatory for the WBO. Seriously, you go back and look at 2016 when there was rumours that he'd be working with Frank Warren, and after it was announced that, they were saying, he's going to get a shot at the winner of Parker versus Ruiz. Now, he never signed officially with Frank Warren. He ended up going and working with Eddie Hearn to fight Tony Bellew, but he could have very well fought the winner of Parker versus Ruiz if he'd stayed. It's crazy, fighting those two guys. It's just ridiculous. Tony Bellew started calling David Haye out at the time. He actually called David Haye out in Goodison Park in May after he won his title. So, yeah, Bellew was looking for that fight. I didn't think that would happen. I didn't know what route David Haye would go down next. But, as it happened, we got the announcement. I think it was November 2016. They announced that David Haye would face Tony Bellew in March 2017 Sky Box Office pay-per-view. So we're like, okay, let's see. I, at the time, thought Bellew is a good fighter. But... this guy got knocked out by Adonis Stevenson. David Haye, similar-ish to Adonis Stevenson, a sharpshooter, bigger puncher probably. I couldn't see that Tony Bellew winning this fight, but I knew it would give me a range of where David Haye is at, because those two guys were just, the less said about them, the better. This is a good example of where David Haye is. We went there against Bellew. I still looked off. He was winning the early rounds. Bellew was very cautious. Then in the 6th round, the injuries came back to play David Haye. There was rumours knocking around that he'd seen an emergency therapist in Brussels, in Belgium, over fears of an injury and that this fight would be postponed. That was what was going around. Obviously, there was some validity to that because David Haye's Achilles went. He managed to last until the 11th round. And actually, if you go back and watch that, I think it was either the 9th or the 10th round. With one leg, David Haye won one of the rounds. That's how cautious Bellew was of David Haye's punching power. It was a sad sight, and it really did show how far David Haye had regressed. He was beaten by Carl Thompson, who was a similar age to David Haye, who was still useful at the time. Carl Thompson at 37, still useful. Still useful at that age. David Haye at the same age, completely finished. The injuries took its toll. They did announce the Bellew rematch, December 2017. Didn't happen in December 2017 though. David Haye, again during training camp, bicep injury. It showed and it said to me that David Haye could not get through a full camp. He couldn't get through a full camp without getting injured. Alright, so I actually thought maybe David Haye is the last we'll see of him. They did announce it. May 2018. Bellew Haye 2. Repeat or revenge. I thought David Haye would win the rematch. I thought he boxed Tony Bellew to a decision. He wouldn't get reckless. He just, knowing the way his body is, he just would take his time. He did that for the first 2 rounds. Won the first 2 rounds. That was fine. Then he got reckless and he got taken out. Looking back in hindsight, it would have been ambitious to think that David Haye could even go 12 rounds, even if he was just boxing Tony Bellew. David Haye, even though he was stopped by punches, the body was breaking up again. You could see his leg was causing him trouble, and you wondered, can David Haye get through 12 rounds? Even if he's doing it at any sort of pace, does he need to just sell out and go for the jugular because his body just can't do it? At that stage now, David Haye retired. Like I said, it was a sad way to go. Look at this. I look at boxing as an entertainment, right? I like the sweet science. I like everything about the sport, but I love being entertained. When I watched David Haye in his prime, in the mid-20 teens and all that, I was always entertained. I didn't like David Haye in a sense of he was, he was economical with the truth. He sold a lot of, mutton dressed as lamb. He did a lot of things that were annoying. But in the ring, he was entertaining, he was exciting, he was explosive, he was everything I like in a fighter. So for me, seeing him go out like that was just like, it was a bit sad. I actually seen David Haye in person in August 2018, and even then he was still walking with a limp. So obviously his body was complete. Realistically, at age, 33, he was finished. His body was just no-mas, enough's enough. He couldn't get through the training camps, it was breaking down. It was apparent back then. But it really came to the forefront years later after the Bellew fight that how bad he'd regressed in terms of his body. It wasn't necessarily his skills, it was just his body just couldn't take it anymore. So Haye retired, he went into managing. Now, it's funny actually, because in May 2018, he was actually goading Derek Chisora into a fight with Joe Joyce, bigging up Joe Joyce, this, that and the other. Come the end of the year, he's managing Derek Chisora. He is managing and he is close-knit with Derek Chisora, a guy who we ended up having to flee a country from, to get away from assault charges. It's crazy how boxing changes, how things change in the sport of boxing. But as it stands, Haye is a pundit, he is a manager, and he's doing quite a good job for Derek Chisora, it has to be said. When I look at Haye's career, when I look at these WTF videos, you kind of stand to see a kind of, it kind of goes up and down. And that's kind of how David Haye is. We started off his career a bit rocky, a bit unsteady with the loss to Carl Thompson. And then he just skyrocketed. And then well, actually, no, it's pretty much overnight. Because he was at a high when he beat Chisora. Because he looked good in that fight. He was meant to have a big payday against Tyson Fury. And then it all came tumbling down. The sand in the hourglass ran out. Injuries. Mainly injuries, actually, when you think about it. David Haye was, obviously when he fought Bellew, his reflexes weren't exactly the same as they were. His speed wasn't the same, but it was mainly his injuries. His body just couldn't take it anymore. It was sad to see, but it was inevitable given the way David Haye overinflated his body, covered up injuries by lifting more weights, etc., etc. Haye's career in a nutshell, how do I sum it up? For me, top 5 cruiserweight of all time. Very good cruiserweight. Heavyweight, he fought the people who were around, most of them anyway, in a time when the division was at its weakest. And even at the cruiserweight division, it wasn't as strong then as it is today, but he did beat the guys who were... David Haye beat who was put in front of him at his time. It has to be said. At cruiserweight, certainly. He never fought Steve Cunningham. Would have been interesting. I reckon Haye would have won. Cunningham was always a bit chinny. But it would have been interesting still. That's David Haye's career in a nutshell. When I look at him today and I put him today, at heavyweight, he'd struggle, definitely. But at cruiserweight, I still think he'd be useful. I think he would beat the likes of Dorticus. I think him and Bradis would be a great fight. I think if Usyk was still there, it would have been a good fight. Him against W.T.F would have been a hell of a fight. So David Haye, overall, a good fighter. A very good fighter. A fighter who achieved a lot. A fighter who did things his way. He didn't get out by 30. But he did what he needed to do. He achieved a lot. Unified cruiserweight champion, heavyweight champion, WBA heavyweight champion. Made a hell of a lot of money. Made a rake of cash for boxing. Was never tied down to a promoter. Did his own thing. So overall, when I look at David Haye's career, it was a good career. It had its highs. It had its lows. But overall, it's been a fun ride. And I've enjoyed doing this. I hope you all have enjoyed watching it. Now, we end it here. My thoughts on this. I think that David Haye made a lot of mistakes in terms of how he decided to sell things, but at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. He made a rake of cash. He still has an okay resume, It's a good resume, it has to be said, but it's not a jaw-dropping resume. If he'd beaten some of the guys that Usyk is beaten, You know, because he cleaned out the cruiserweight division. You know, there were still guys knocking around like Steve Cunningham at the time. But Haye overall, decent career, achieved a lot, made a lot of money. He gave us all a lot of entertaining fights, and for that, you got a big David Haye up in that respect. I'm going to call it here. Hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoy making these. I hope this is going out on a Monday. I hope this gives you a good start to the week and whatever you're going through. I hope you get through it. I hope it's a good week for us all. Lads and lassies, if you could, make my day. Smash the like button. Subscribe, of course, if you're new. #GMansRocks. All that good stuff. Lads and lassies, I'll leave you here. I'll talk to you.